The galaxy had never known silence like this before. On every inhabited world, across every space station, in every ship drifting through the endless black, billions of beings watched their screens. The collective broadcasting network had promised the greatest moment in galactic history. They had promised the end of humanity's hope. Commander stood tall on the elevated platform, his four arms spread wide as the cameras captured every angle of his victory. Behind him, the massive viewing screen showed the blue marble of Earth, now and burning. Smoke clouds covered entire continents. The oceans had turned gray from the ash of fallen cities. This was what remained of the species that had dared to challenge the collective. Citizens of the galaxy, his voice boomed across 1,000 worlds, today marks the end of the human problem. The crowd gathered in the grand arena of Nexus Prime cheered. Thousands of different species raised their appendages, tentacles, and claws in celebration. For 3 long years, the war against humanity had consumed everything. Resources, lives, entire fleets had been lost to these small, fragile creatures who refused to die quietly. But now it was over. The humans had been broken. Turned and gestured toward the holding chamber behind him. The transparent walls showed a small figure inside. A child. A human child no older than 7 Earth years. She had brown hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that held no tears. She sat in the corner of the chamber, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at nothing. "This," announced proudly, "is the last of them, the final human. We found her hiding in the ruins of what they called Moscow, the last survivor of a species that thought they could stand against us." The crowd roared with approval. On countless worlds, beings celebrated in the streets. The humans had terrified them. Stories of human soldiers continuing to fight with missing limbs, of human ships ramming into enemies when their weapons failed, of human cities choosing destruction over surrender. These stories had haunted the dreams of the galaxy's children. But now that nightmare was ending. In the holding chamber, the girl looked up. Her name was Maya, though nobody had asked for it. She had survived for 3 months in the frozen ruins of her city, eating whatever she could find, hiding from the patrols that hunted the last survivors. Her parents had died protecting her. Her brother had led the aliens away from her hiding spot and never returned. Everyone she had ever known was gone. She was 7 years old, and she understood that she was about to die. The broadcast continued as explained the history of the conflict, how humanity had refused to submit to the collective's authority, how they had fought back when the first invasion fleets arrived, how their primitive nuclear weapons had actually destroyed 3 collective carriers before they were overwhelmed. The commander spoke of human stubbornness as if it were a disease that needed to be cured. "They could have lived," said, shaking his head in mock sadness. "All they had to do was accept their place, serve the collective as laborers, as resources, but they chose pride, they chose resistance, and now," he gestured at Maya, "now they chose extinction." What did not mention was the cost. He did not speak of the 200 million collective soldiers who had died in the war. He did not mention the 17 worlds that humanity had rendered uninhabitable with their desperate attacks. He did not talk about the fleet of suicide ships that had broken through their lines and destroyed the sacred breeding grounds of the people. He did not admit that this small species, with their short and fragile bodies, had cost the collective more than any enemy in recorded history. No, today was for celebration, not truth. On Earth, in a bunker buried 2 miles beneath the surface of the Antarctic continent, Admiral Sarah watched the broadcast. She was 83 years old, though the weight of command made her feel much older. Around her, the last of humanity's military leaders sat in grim silence. There were only 47 of them left. 47 humans who had survived the orbital bombardment, the purges, and the systematic hunting that had followed. "They have Maya," General said, his voice hollow. "She was the last child, the last one anywhere." Admiral nodded slowly. She remembered when Maya had been born 7 years ago on a research station orbiting Mars, the first birth after the war began. Her parents had named her Hope, but she preferred Maya. The entire surviving human population had celebrated that birth, a new generation, a future. Now that future sat in a glass cage, waiting to die for the entertainment of aliens. "Can we reach her?" someone asked. "No's" response was final. "We have nothing left that can break through their fleet, nothing that can cross that distance in time." The bunker fell silent. On the screen was still speaking, explaining how the execution would proceed. It would be painless, he promised. The collective was not cruel. They simply needed to ensure that not a single human remained, that the threat was ended forever. But there was something the collective did not know, something that humanity had kept secret even as their cities burned and their people died. A final option, a last resort so terrible that it had never been used, had never even been seriously considered until now. The humans called it the Prometheus Protocol. Admiral stood and walked to the command console at the center of the room. Her fingers hovered over a panel that required her genetic signature, her voice code, and her final authorization. This panel had never been activated. It had been installed 50 years ago, when humanity first made contact with the stars and realized that not everyone out there was friendly. It had been updated and improved over the decades, connected to systems that no one outside this room knew existed. General said carefully, "If you activate that, there's no going back." Looked at him. Her eyes held decades of pain. She had lost her husband in the first attack. Her daughters had died when San Francisco was destroyed. Her had been on Luna when the collective cracked the colony domes and watched the air escape into space. Everyone she had ever loved was gone. And now they were going to kill Maya, the last human child, the last hope of her species. On the screen was approaching the holding chamber. 2 guards flanked him, carrying the device that would end Maya's life. It looked almost medical, a simple injection system, quick and clean. The galaxy wanted to see humanity end with a whimper, not a bang. Maya stood up as they approached. She was small, even for a human child. Her clothes were torn and dirty from her months of hiding, but she did not cry. She did not beg. She simply looked at the camera with those dark, serious eyes and waited. "Any last words?" asked, leaning down to her level. He was playing to the cameras, showing the galaxy how merciful the collective could be. "We will broadcast them across the stars, a final message from the human species." Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice small but clear. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," she said, "about monsters who hurt children. She said that in those stories the monsters always think they've won. They always celebrate too early." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "She said that's when the heroes come." Laughed, the crowd laughed with him. What heroes? The human military had been shattered. Their fleet was scrap metal floating in orbit. Their armies were dust. There was no one left to save this child, no one left to fight for humanity. But somewhere in the Antarctic ice, Admiral Sarah pressed her hand against the authorization panel. "Genetic signature confirmed," the computer said. She spoke the code that only she knew. Words in a dead language, chosen specifically because no translator could ever accidentally trigger them. Voice authorization confirmed. She typed in the final sequence, 20 characters, the names of her. Final authorization confirmed. Prometheus Protocol activated. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, machines that had waited for decades began to wake. Across the solar system, satellites that had been disguised as debris started to move. And in the dark spaces between stars, where humanity had quietly hidden their greatest achievements, something ancient and terrible opened its eyes. The collective had no idea what they had just awakened. On the broadcast, reached for Maya. The injection device hummed to life. Billions of beings across the galaxy held their breath, waiting for the moment when the last human would finally fall. Then the alarm started. At first, it was just the collective flagship. Warning lights flashed across the bridge as sensors detected something impossible. Then, it was the entire fleet in orbit around Nexus Prime. Then stations throughout the system began reporting the same readings. Something was coming. Something was coming from every direction at once. Paused, his hand halfway to Maya. He touched the communication device on his wrist. What is happening? The response came in fragments, overlapping voices of panic and confusion. Thousands of ships. No, millions of ships. No, the sensors must be malfunctioning. These readings were impossible. Nothing could move that fast. Nothing could generate that much power. But the readings were not wrong. In the 37 seconds since Admiral activated the Prometheus Protocol, humanity's secret fleet had begun to move. Ships that had been built in hidden facilities across a dozen moons. Ships that had been crewed by artificial intelligences so advanced that the collective's technology looked like stone tools in comparison. Ships that had been designed for one purpose and one purpose only. Revenge. Maya looked up at and smiled. It was a small smile, innocent in the way only a child's smile could be. But there was something in her eyes now, something that made the commander take a step back without understanding why. My grandmother also told me, Maya said softly, that humans never forget, and we never forgive. The first wave of ships entered the system. They did not fire weapons. They did not need to. They simply passed through the collective fleet, moving so fast that the defensive systems could not even track them. In their wake, every ship they passed went dark. Every system failed. Every soldier aboard found themselves floating in cold, silent darkness. It was not destruction. It was worse than destruction. It was helplessness. On the broadcast, now stuttering as communication arrays failed across the system, watched in horror as his fleet died around him. Not in fire and explosion, but in quiet, absolute shutdown. Ships that had taken decades to build, that had conquered 100 worlds, became nothing more than floating tombs in moments. "What is this?" he screamed at the cameras. "What is happening?" The answer came from the broadcast system itself. A human voice, calm and cold, speaking in every language the galaxy knew. "You destroyed our cities, we watched." The fleet continued its advance. More ships emerged from fold space, appearing in systems across collective territory. Hundreds of worlds went dark as their defense networks collapsed. Orbital stations fell silent. Communication networks that had connected the galaxy for suddenly carried only one message. "You hunted our children, we watched." On Nexus Prime, the grand arena's lights flickered. The massive screens that had been showing the execution broadcast now showed something else. Human faces, billions of them. Every human who had died in the war, their images scrolling past faster than any eye could follow. Fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, children, so many children. "You celebrated our extinction, we watched." The message paused. In the silence, the only sound was Maya's quiet breathing as she stood in her glass cage, watching her captors realize the truth. "We told you to pray." The collectives was next. The ancient seat of their power, untouched by war for 10,000 years, suddenly found itself surrounded. Not by weapons, but by something far more terrifying. Satellites that broadcast on frequencies that should not exist. Signals that reached into the communication networks, the databases, the very memory of the collective itself. And they began to delete. History, science, art, everything that the collective had built over started to disappear, not destroyed but erased, made as if it had never existed at all. The punishment was not death. Death would have been mercy. The punishment was forgetting. Earth shows no mercy. Admiral watched from her bunker as the Prometheus Protocol executed its programming. She had known what it would do. She had known the cost. The systems that humanity had secretly built were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were something older, something more terrible. They were justice. The collective had thought that humanity was weak because humans died easily. They had thought that humanity was primitive because their technology was young. They had not understood that humans had spent their entire existence fighting against extinction. Ice ages, plagues, world wars, near misses with asteroids. Again and again, humanity had looked into the void and refused to fall. And in that refusal, they had learned something. They had learned that some things were worse than death. On Nexus Prime tried to run. The chamber doors would not open. The communication systems would not respond. He was trapped in the arena with the child he had come to execute, surrounded by crowds that were now screaming in terror as they realized what was happening. The screens showed more images now. Collective soldiers dying in the war they had started. Collective cities burning as human suicide ships crashed into them. Collective families mourning loved ones who would never come home. The galaxy was being shown the cost of the war it had cheered for. The true cost. The cost the broadcasts had never mentioned. You wanted to see the end of humanity, the voice continued. You gathered to celebrate. You cheered as we died. You laughed as our children were hunted. Maya walked to the glass wall of her chamber and pressed her small hand against it. Outside, stumbled backward, falling over the guards who had been frozen in shock. Now watch, the voice said. Watch what your celebration has earned. The Prometheus Protocol was not designed to destroy the collective. Destruction was too simple, too clean. Humanity had spent 3 years being exterminated, and in that time they had learned what true cruelty looked like. So they designed something better. The protocol was designed to take everything the collective valued. Their history would be erased from their own records. Their technology would be turned against them. Their children would grow up not knowing the glory of their ancestors. Their elders would watch everything they had built disappear, not in fire, but in silence. And at the center of it all, on every screen across the galaxy, would be the face of a 7-year-old girl. A reminder. A warning. This is what happens when you harm our children. The bunker shook as systems continued to activate around the world. Admiral did not look away from the screen. She watched as the collective's fleet fell. She watched as there went dark. She watched as 17,000 years of alien civilization began to crumble. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel joy. She felt only the cold, empty weight of necessity. For Maya, she whispered, for all of them. The broadcast continued. The screaming had stopped in the grand arena of Nexus Prime, not because the terror had faded, but because those gathered there had no more voice left. Thousands of beings from dozens of species sat in their seats, unable to move, unable to look away from the screens that now showed them their own doom. Remained on his knees before the glass chamber. His 4 arms hung limp at his sides. His eyes, designed to see across multiple spectrums of light, could not process what they were witnessing. His fleet, the greatest military force the collective had ever assembled, was gone. Not destroyed. Simply gone. Dark shapes floating in the void, their crews alive but trapped in ships that would never fly again. Maya pressed her hand against the glass, watching him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was louder than any words could have been. Across the galaxy, the human voice continued its broadcast. Cold, precise, unstoppable. For 3 years you hunted us. You burned our cities while we slept. You poisoned our water and our air. You found our hiding places and dragged us into the light. You made entertainment of our suffering. You gave awards to the soldiers who killed the most of us. You called it pest control. The images on the screens shifted. Security footage from human cities during the invasion. Families running through streets choked with smoke. Children crying over the bodies of their parents. Soldiers making last stands in ruins, fighting until their ammunition ran out, and then fighting with their hands. the truth of the war that the collective had hidden from its citizens. You told your children that we were monsters. You taught them to fear the human hiding in the dark. You made us the villains of your stories, the creatures in your nightmares. On the collective, the capital city had gone completely dark. Emergency power struggled to maintain basic systems. In the Senate chamber, where the leaders of 1,000 worlds had gathered to celebrate humanity's extinction, there was only chaos. Representatives screamed at each other, demanding answers that no one could provide. Security forces tried to restore order, but their weapons no longer functioned. Their communications were dead. They were as helpless as the humans they had spent 3 years killing. You were right to be afraid. The human fleet did not attack with weapons. It did not need to. The technology humanity had secretly developed over the past 50 years made conventional warfare obsolete. Electromagnetic pulses that could disable entire planets, artificial intelligences that could infiltrate any computer system, nanomachines that could turn any substance into dust, and something else, something the collective scientists would spend decades trying to understand. Memory erasure. Not just databases, not just records. The actual memories of individuals could be targeted and removed. The collective's greatest warriors suddenly forgot how to fight. Their scientists forgot their formulas. Their leaders forgot their own names. It was not death. Death would have been a kindness. This was worse. This was being made into nothing while still alive. You celebrated when you killed our last child. You cheered. You applauded. You called it the greatest moment in galactic history. In the Antarctic bunker, Admiral monitored the protocol's progress. 17 major collective worlds had been completely shut down. Their defense grids were offline. Their fleets were stranded. Their governments were in chaos. The war that humanity had been losing for 3 years had been reversed in less than an hour. But she took no joy in it. General stood beside her watching the same data. His face was pale. "How long do we continue?" he asked. "Until they remember," replied. "Until every being in this galaxy knows what happens when you try to exterminate humanity." And Maya closed her eyes for a moment. The extraction team is already on approach. They will reach Nexus Prime within the hour. What the collective did not understand, what they had never understood, was that humanity had been planning for this from the beginning. The moment first contact was made, 50 years before the war, human scientists had begun preparing for the worst. They had studied the collective's technology, found its weaknesses, and developed counters for every weapon in their arsenal. They had built hidden bases throughout the solar system and beyond. They had created artificial intelligences smarter than any biological mind. They had prepared for extinction. Because that was what humans did, they survived. On Nexus Prime finally found his voice. "Please," he whispered, looking up at Maya through the glass. "Please, we did not know, we did not understand." Maya tilted her head, studying him. In her 7 years of life, she had learned things that no child should know. She had learned what it meant to be hunted. She had learned what it felt like to watch everyone she loved die. She had learned that the universe was cold and cruel and cared nothing for the innocent. "My mother begged," Maya said quietly, "when your soldiers came for us. She begged them to take her instead, to let me go. She said I was just a child. She said I had done nothing wrong." Flinched as if struck. "They laughed at her. They made her watch while they hurt my brother. They told her that human children grew into human soldiers and they did not want any more human soldiers. Then they killed her while I hid under the floor. I could see everything through the cracks in the boards. I saw my mother die." The commander's head dropped. For a moment, he was not a military leader, not a celebrated hero of the collective. He was simply a being who had just realized the full weight of what he had done. "I was under that floor for 3 days," Maya continued. "I could not move, I could not cry, I could not do anything except wait for them to find me, but they did not find me. They moved on to the next house, the next family, the next children." Around the arena, the screens began showing new footage. Human children, thousands of them, images from before the war when they had been alive and happy, smiling at birthday parties, playing in parks, sleeping in their beds, safe and warm. Each image was labeled with a name and an age. Most were under 10 years old. "These are the children you killed," the voice announced. "Not soldiers, not threats. Children, they had done nothing to you. They did not even know your war was coming, but you killed them anyway. You killed them because they were human, because they might grow up, because they might remember." The images continued. There were so many, too many to count. Human children from every continent on Earth, from every colony in the solar system. Brown-skinned children from South Asia, pale children from Northern Europe, children with black hair and children with red hair and children who had just learned to walk. All gone, all erased from the universe because the collective had decided that humans were too dangerous to live. You wanted to make sure we never forgot our place. You wanted to make sure we never fought back again. You wanted to break us so completely that the very idea of human resistance would become a joke. On the collective, something began to happen that had not happened in 10,000 years. The citizens began to feel something other than superiority. They began to feel shame. The images of dead human children, broadcast into every home, every school, every government building, forced them to see what they had celebrated, forced them to understand what their cheers had meant. You failed. The human fleet continued its advance. System by system, the collective's territory fell dark, not conquered, not occupied, simply shut down. Every piece of technology the collective relied on, every convenience of their civilization, every comfort they had built over was taken from them, not destroyed, just made unreachable. Earth shows no mercy. Admiral received the first reports from the extraction team. They had reached Nexus Prime. They were approaching the grand arena. Maya would be retrieved within minutes, but did not allow herself to feel relief. Not yet. Not until the child was safely aboard a human ship. Not until she could look into Maya's eyes and tell her that she was safe. The protocol continued to execute. On 17,000 worlds, the same message played on endless loop. The faces of human children, the truth of the war, the cost of the collective's victory. Some species tried to resist. They gathered their weapons and marched into the streets, determined to fight this invisible enemy. But there was nothing to fight. No army to face, no ships to shoot, just systems that no longer worked and a voice that would not stop speaking. You will remember us now, not as the pests you exterminated, not as the primitives you crushed. You will remember us as the species that survived, the species that waited, the species that made you pay for every drop of human blood you spilled. In the grand arena, the glass walls of Maya's chamber dissolved. Not shattered or opened, simply dissolved as if they had never existed. The child stepped out onto the platform, passing within arm's reach of. He did not move. He could not move. Something had locked his muscles in place, leaving him frozen in his position of defeat. You wanted to kill the last human child, Maya said, looking down at him. You wanted the galaxy to watch. You wanted everyone to see how powerful the collective was. How unstoppable. She crouched down to his eye level. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. She was 7 years old and she had more control than the military commander who had tried to execute her. Now they will see something else. They will see what happens when you make humanity angry. A human ship descended through the atmosphere of Nexus Prime. It was small, barely large enough for a crew of 3, but it moved through the planet's defense grid as if those systems did not exist. Because for all practical purposes, they did not. The Prometheus Protocol had made every defense, every weapon, every threat the collective could offer completely meaningless. The ship landed in the arena. Its doors opened and 2 human soldiers stepped out. They were old. Everyone in what remained of humanity's military was old. The young had all died in the war, but they moved with purpose, with discipline, with the absolute certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. "Admiral sends her regards," one of them said to Maya. "She wanted us to tell you something." Maya looked up at them, waiting. "She wanted you to know that you are not the last anymore." For the first time since the broadcast began, something changed in Maya's expression. A crack in the armor she had built around herself. A glimpse of the child she had been before the war took everything from her. "What do you mean?" The soldier smiled. It was a tired smile, worn down by years of fighting and loss, but it was genuine. The protocol included medical facilities, cloning bays, genetic repositories we had hidden across the solar system. Admiral activated them all. By the time you reach Earth, there will be others. Not many yet, but others. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She had not cried when her parents died. She had not cried during the 3 months she spent hiding in the ruins of Moscow. She had not cried when threatened to execute her on live broadcast. But now, hearing that she was not alone, that humanity would continue, that there would be other children someday, she could not hold back any longer. The soldier knelt beside her and held out his hand. "Come on, little one, it is time to go home." Maya took his hand. As they walked toward the ship, she paused and looked back at, still frozen on the platform. "My grandmother told me one more thing," she said. "She told me that humans do not start wars, we end them." The ship rose from the arena and climbed into the sky. Behind it, the grand arena fell silent. Thousands of beings sat in their seats, watching the last human child disappear into the clouds, knowing that they had just witnessed something that would change the galaxy forever. The broadcast continued for 3 more days. Every image, every name, every story of human suffering that the collective had ignored or celebrated. The galaxy could not look away. The protocol would not let them. It forced them to see, to understand, to remember. On the 3rd day, the voice spoke one final time. "We could destroy you. We could erase your civilizations the way you tried to erase ours. We have the technology. We have the capability. We have more than enough reason." A pause. The screen showed Earth, slowly healing, clouds of smoke beginning to clear, green starting to return to the scorched continents. "But we will not. Destruction is easy. Anyone can destroy. What we want is something harder, something that will last longer than fire and blood." The images shifted to show the human fleet, now stationed in orbit around the collective. Millions of ships, more than anyone had believed possible, arranged in formations that spoke of absolute military superiority. They did not attack. They did not need to. "We want you to remember. We want every generation from now until the end of time to know what happens when you attack humanity. We want your children to grow up hearing stories about us, not as victims, not as pests to be exterminated, as the species you should never have touched." Admiral watched from her bunker as the message concluded. Around her, the surviving leaders of humanity sat in exhausted silence. They had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable, they had won. But the victory felt hollow. Too much had been lost. Too many graves would never be filled. "What happens now?" General asked. Did not answer immediately. She looked at the screen showing Maya's ship approaching Earth, at the child who had become a symbol for everything humanity had lost and everything they still hoped to preserve. "Now we rebuild," she said finally. "Now we make sure this never happens again. And now we remind the galaxy why they should have left us alone." The Prometheus Protocol was designed to last for exactly 100 years. For the next century, the collective's technology would remain crippled. Their fleets would stay grounded. Their empires would struggle to maintain basic functions, not destroyed, not conquered, just humbled, just reminded of their place in a universe they had thought they controlled. Humanity did not want territory. They did not want resources. They did not want slaves or tribute or worship. They wanted only one thing: respect. And they had earned it in the only way the galaxy understood. Through power. Through patience. through a willingness to sacrifice everything for the survival of their children. Maya arrived on Earth 3 days after her rescue. She stepped off the ship onto soil that had been scorched by orbital bombardment into air that still carried the taste of smoke. But she was smiling, because there were people waiting for her, not many. Just a few dozen survivors who had come to welcome her home, but they were there, humans, alive, standing in the ruins of their world ready to rebuild. Admiral was among them. She walked forward and knelt before Maya, looking into the eyes of the child who had become the most famous human in galactic history. "Welcome home, Maya." The child looked around at the destruction, at the scars that covered everything she could see. Then she looked back at the Admiral. "Can we really fix all of this?" Smiled. It was the first real smile she had allowed herself in 3 years. "We are human. Fixing things is what we do." The galaxy watched as humanity began to rebuild. They watched as new cities rose from the ashes of the old. They watched as children were born, carefully brought into existence through technology that had been hidden from the war. They watched as a species that should have been extinct instead grew stronger with each passing year. And they remembered. They remembered the child in the glass cage who had not cried. They remembered the fleet that had appeared from nowhere. They remembered the voice that had spoken into their minds, telling them the price of their cruelty. They remembered that Earth showed no mercy. 100 years later, when the Prometheus Protocol finally released its hold on collective technology, things had changed. The old empires had fractured. New alliances had formed. And at the center of it all stood humanity, no longer a small species on a single world, but a power that stretched across 100 systems. Maya had grown old by then. She had lived to see her people rise from the ashes. She had watched as human ships carried the flag of Earth to stars that had never known human presence. She had become a leader, then a symbol, then a legend. On the day she died, surrounded by her children and ingrate, she spoke her final words. Tell them what we survived. Tell them what we built, and tell them," she paused, gathering her last breath. "Tell them we never forgot and we never forgave." Across the galaxy, the story was told. In schools and homes and ships traveling through the endless black, beings of every species learned about the humans. The creatures who had seemed so fragile. The primitives who had seemed so easy to crush. The species that had nearly been exterminated and had instead become the most feared civilization in known space. They told stories of the last human child, standing in a glass cage, watching her executioner fall. They told stories of the fleet that could not be stopped, that moved through space like ghosts, that turned the greatest military power in the galaxy into nothing. They told stories of a voice that had spoken into every mind, demanding that the universe remember. And when their children asked why they should not start wars, why they should not hurt the innocent, why they should never underestimate an enemy, they told them one thing. Because you might be facing humans. And humans never forget. The end.